One thing I hear in my job all the time, and anybody who loves books will hear this, is people will always say, oh, the book was better. And 90% of the time, they're absolutely right. There are some good adaptations out there, but usually books are better. The reason why they're better is that they are the original artifact. Adaptations will often try and change them because they say that the story doesn't fit the format, doesn't fit in film or TV or what have you. And often those things are just fudges. So let's just talk about this. What this isn't going to be is a rant about colourblind casting and the way that the cuckoos, the Midwich cuckoos, have been played by all sorts of children of different ethnic backgrounds, different skin colours, and what have you. And the same with the people of Midwich, because obviously it's been brought up to date. It's a bit more multicultural. Whether there actually are many small English villages like Midwich which are countercultural is another matter entirely, of course, but I'll leave that for somebody else to debate. It's not like the Doctor Who thing. I've seen people get very excited about the idea that Doctor Who, you know, is changing sex, is changing colour, what have you, is changing orientation. Well, of course, this is perfectly permissible. Doctor Who is science fiction. Doctor Who is an alien. He's an extraterrestrial. He, she, it, whatever. You know, Doctor Who is not a human being, is not Homo sapiens. It's from another planet. Humanoid shape, but the fact that Doctor Who can regenerate, change shape, you don't really know what the ultimate form of the Gallifreyans is. But so that's kind of a silly thing, because science fiction allows for that, and that's been covered in science fiction literature going back to the 50s by people like Theodore Sturgeon, by Ursula Le Guin in the 1960s in The Left Hand of Darkness. None of this is new stuff to written SF. So it's not about that. However, to depict the cuckoo children as being diverse is a major fail, and I'm going to explain why. Hello, this is Stephen E. Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. If you're not, welcome back. And today I want to talk a bit about The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, one of my favourite books. The book I believe is Wyndham's finest novel. And I want to talk about it in relation to the recent TV adaptation made by Sky, which has had a lot of attention. So for people who aren't familiar with this channel, just to give you a bit of idea, I think there's an awful lot of stuff on the internet out there. There's people commenting on things they really know nothing about, and I just wanted to stamp my authority on this a bit. So sort of do indulge me a moment. So I am the author of this book, 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, which came out in 2006, which is one of the best-selling guides to SF ever published in the UK. I've worked in the book trade for 38 years. I've been reading science fiction for 50 years. I read all sorts of other things. Wyndham was my first love. I've read Midwich Cuckoos many times. I've read a lot of the supporting texts. I know a member of the Wyndham family. So, you know, I'd like to sort of you to think that I am sort of speaking from a position of some authority here, and it's just not somebody who's walked off the street, you know. So as Helen Ellison said, you're not entitled to your opinion, you're entitled to your informed opinion. So what I'm going to give you today is an informed opinion about the Midwich Cuckoos and why I think the television series is fundamentally flawed, and in trying to put across some contemporary messages is missing the point that those messages were already there. So let's kick off. I'm not going to mention the series too much because ultimately adaptations of books don't matter. What matters is the books themselves. And as Raymond Chandler said when he was asked, you know, what do you think of what Hollywood's done to your books? He said, well, it's done nothing to my books. They're still on the shelf there. But part of the problem is, of course, is there are far more people will watch a TV series or watch a film adaptation than read the original novel, because it's just easier. You know, a book is less accessible. You have to put more effort in, requires more thought. And, you know, we have a mass media culture. So even though there are lots of people reading, watching is still a primary thing in our culture. And people will take what they see as read. There have been 2 film versions of The Midwich Cuckoos, Village of the Damned, and the cover which looks like this. And it's not a bad adaptation. There's a sequel which has nothing to do with Wyndham's ideas, so we should discount that. It's not canonical. It's called Children of the Damned. One of the reasons why there haven't been many adaptations is because, and I was told this by somebody in the Wyndham family, allegedly there is infighting between the surviving members of the family about what should be made, what shouldn't be made, the amount of money that should be paid and what have you. And that's why there's not more adaptations. In my view, that's a good thing, because the ones we've seen have generally been terrible. John Wyndham, of course, was the person who really popularised science fiction in the UK. Now, you could say that H.G. Wells did that before him, but of course, when H.G. Wells was writing his scientific romances, as they were called then, the term science fiction wasn't in use. It wasn't in use till the mid-1920s, didn't really get stamped onto books until the 1950s, and, you know, Penguin were at pains to sort of say that it was unhappily called science fiction. And this is my original copy of the MIDWICH CUCKOOS, which I bought in 1976 when I was 12. And, you know, it's seen a lot of action. So I've read it many, many times. And over the years, I've come to realise that it's easily Wyndham's best book, despite the fact that many people always cleave to The Day of the Triffids because it was his first breakthrough novel. And, you know, it has such iconic power. When he broke through, he was this sort of overnight success with Day of the Triffids in the early 50s, except that he wasn't. He'd been writing for many years before that, since the early 30s. His first books came out, I think, about 1935, was Foul Play Suspected, was his first novel, a very, very rare crime novel. And he was writing science fiction for American markets, for magazines, and he wrote in a very American style. And his byline then tended to be Bainan Harris or John Bainan, because his full name was John Wyndham Lucas Parks Bainan Harris. Some sources say John Wyndham Parks Lucas Bainan Harris, but it doesn't really matter. We know him as John Wyndham, but he didn't decide to use the name John Wyndham until Triffids. Before that, he was doing all sorts of other things. Now, of course, Wyndham experienced World War II, and his post-war work reveals this, and it's quite different to his pre-war work. And you can see, even in the efforts which weren't sort of released at the time between the end of World War II and Triffids appearing, there were some sort of efforts to try and encompass the experience and lessons of World War II into his writing. Some of the sort of later classic themes in his early work, which are basically social Darwinism and the ethics around survival. Is it right to kill to survive? Is it right to kill another species to survive? What do we do when there are mutations in human beings that cause leaps forward? And we see that in the chrysalids. Now, the chrysalids, of course, is the sort of flip on its head version of the MIDWICH CUCKOOS, and there's the New York Review of Books edition, which you don't often see much in the UK. My second favourite novel by Wyndham. For a long time, my favourite, but these days I very much cleave to MIDWICH. And you know, these ethical questions came up again and again in Wyndham's mature work. They are there in his work before World War II, but they're not so prevalent. And you see the beginnings of them in a story called Exiles on Asperas, which dates to the late 30s, which I referred to many, many times. And I see it as cardinally important because I also think it influenced Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End. It's about adaptation and what children can adapt to. And it's a very, very good story, so do take a look at it. So Darwin's theme, as I say, was social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, evolution, and how society cope with that or not. And he writes about the ethics of this. Even in the early Wyndham catastrophe novels, when he becomes John Wyndham and he stops being John Bainan, or any of the other names he used to publish his earlier writing, you see that in things like Day of the Triffids, where, of course, a lot of people are blinded by satellite weapons. No, it's not comet debris. People think it's comet debris. If you read the novel closely, you see his satellite weapons have gone off and blinded everybody. So straight away, Wyndham is really talking about big things. Early in the atomic age, he was talking about Star Wars type satellite weapons. He was talking about genetic engineering of the Triffids. And for me, the main problem with Day of the Triffids is the Triffids themselves are rather unbelievable, whereas the alien invaders by proxy of MIDWICH are a lot more credible, I feel. But I still love Triffids. You can't not love it. It's a fantastic book. It's worth remembering, of course, in the 50s we had the Cold War, and the Triffids and the satellite weapons in Day of the Triffids have, you know, things which had gone wrong. So, you know, there was obviously concern that the war could start, you know, and everything could go up in flames and what have you. It'd be the end of the world. But it's really important that we look at Wyndham in detail, because he's often misinterpreted when it comes to detail. And the satellite weapons thing, which you miss if you don't close read, is a classic example of this. The Midwich Cuckoos is clearly a response to the Nazi ideal of Aryan supermen who are identical, blonde, blue-eyed, perfect Übermensch, you know, that Nietzschean vision. It's also a reflection of the idea of communist orthodoxy and how everybody on communism felt and thought the same and what have you. And we see that a lot in 50s SF, particularly in the early 50s, and around about 52, 53, we saw that in The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney, filmed as Invasion of the Body Snatchers and filmed 3 times since. We also see that in the Robert Heinlein's The Puppet Masters, and we see it in Nigel Neal's Quatermass 2, the BBC TV series. So it was a theme that was in the air, and it's deemed to be one of the things about 50s SF. 50s mass media SF is paranoid about communism. But it's also sometimes referring back to the war, particularly when you think that Britain was an island. At one point during the Battle of Britain, we were the only country actively opposing the Axis, so we stood alone and inviolate. And there's something about an island that, you know, does sort of make the people feel that they are somehow separate, and maybe it brings something, some pride. But the whole point is that the island is a symbol in British SF. It has been, and the island in literature tends to be a symbol of an allowance in the narrative for things that wouldn't happen in a mainland culture. So that whole island siege mentality of World War II is really important in writers like Wyndham and in post-war British SF. Wyndham had already tried to tackle the idea of the Nazi Übermensch in a novel which wasn't published at the time, which a novel which he was writing supposedly contemporaneously or just before Day of the Triffids. And that's a book called Plan for Chaos. And Plan for Chaos, I've got a copy here, bear with me. Plan for Chaos was only published about 10 years ago, and it's a broken back novel. It's put together from 2 different manuscripts, and the first part is set in New York. It has a British protagonist, and it has a kind of hard-boiled American tone, which he was trying to write, not very convincingly, and then halfway through it's a different style. And the basic idea of this is about Nazi clones, and, you know, this is decades before Ira Levin's The Boys from Brazil, which looks like this. So you get this rather broken back thing, but it is interesting. It's not a fantastic read, but if you're a Wyndham fan, it's a really important read, because it does show you his thinking around what he experienced and heard about the Nazis in World War II, and also his thoughts which led towards Midwich, Cuckoos and the Chrysalids. Also, you know, you see how it filters into popular culture. If you read Grant Morrison's take on the X-Men, which must be 20, 25 years ago, he drew on the influences of both John Wyndham and Ira Levin, with the little girls who were taught by Emma Frost in the X-Men school, who were called the Stepford Cuckoos rather than Midwich Cuckoos. And that's sort of typical of really good recursive postmodern writing, as opposed to the kind of things that people making bad TV adaptations do, because Grant really understands the material. It's in Midwich and Chrysalids onward that you really get these debates around survival of the fittest and what you should do ethically when confronted with the Darwinian reality of evolution, of what you should do. And that's the really important thing in Wyndham's work, I feel. And to me, this very, very much relates back to what the world experienced in World War II. Let's look in a bit more detail at Midwich and what it's really about, and how this sort of idea to get diversity in has actually undermined itself, ironically. The main protagonist of the novel is Gordon Zellaby, who is a philosopher and writer. He's a moral philosopher, and that's his profession. That's how he earns his money. So obviously he's an ideal vehicle for Wyndham to get across his ideas. And science fiction, of course, is the novel of ideas. The hero of a science fiction novel isn't the characters, it is the ideas. And Celebi is kind of the mouthpiece of those characters. He's a wonderfully well-drawn character as well. You know, he's infuriating and fascinating by turn. And I actually really like him. You know, he sort of thinks aloud throughout the book, and it's just absolutely wonderful and illusory and elusive, but sometimes he's direct, and that's the beauty of it. He's a sort of great intellectual character of SF. So, you know, the key message that Wyndham wants to get across in Midwich is what is ethically correct. Should you destroy a new species that threatens to supplant you? And that is the sort of moral dilemma that Celebi and the people in Midwich are confronted with throughout the book. So Celebi is seen through the eyes of the narrator Richard Gayford, and he explores the moral dilemmas and decides to take action. Now, in the text of the book, there is no ambiguity about the origins of the Midwich cuckoos. When the day out occurs and it's investigated and a plane is flown overhead at a safe site, photographs are taken, and in one of the photographs on the ground there's a vehicle, like the inverted bowl of a spoon is described. It's a flying saucer. It's that simple. And then it disappears. So during the day out, the gas has covered the village like a dome, like an invisible dome, and the occupants of the craft have got out. They've gone to all the women of childbearing age and they've implanted their eggs. They haven't fertilized the women. The eggs are already fertilized. This is the whole thing. A cuckoo, when it lays its eggs in another bird's nest, it lays them already fertilized. The birds have nothing to do with it. They just, you know, they're hosts. They just mindlessly look after the chicks because they think they're their own. They know no better. And that's the thing. So the nest in Midwich cuckoos isn't Midwich. The nests are the wombs of the women involved. So this again is a comment on Nazi ideas of eugenics, of genetic engineering, and creating the perfect race. So the question is, why does this happen? Well, of course, the aliens are unknowable. We can't know them, but obviously it's a colonization attempt to spread throughout the galaxy, what have you. We don't know what their motives are, but we simply know that they wish to colonize the Earth and push us out of the nest, push us over the edge, and, you know, supplant the human race. That's their plan. Also, the whole question of diversity is in the novel as well, but the diversity is brought into the frame by looking at the uniformity of the children rather than the diversity. And this is where the devil is the detail. Now, the idea of a changeling, of a being put into somebody else's body or somebody else's nest, goes way, way back. It's a common sort of narrative in fantasy fiction in Poole Anderson's The Broken Sword from 1953, which is set in 8th century Dark Ages England. You get this thing about trolls and elves having wars, and one creates a changeling interbreeding with a human woman. They put it in, you know, and they swap kids and that sort of thing. So, you know, it's a really old theme. There's been much said also in the media, on social media, what have you, about the focus in the new TV show on it forefronting female characters and reproductive rights, as if this is something new. You know, this is not new, it's in the novel. The idea that the novel doesn't depict the feelings and plight of the women carrying and raising the cuckoo children initially is completely flawed. Admittedly, women are not always foregrounded, though I would say Celebi's wife is, and his daughter Ferelyn is as well. And Janet, Gayford's wife, also plays quite a part. And there are lots of female characters in the books. Now, of course, the structure of administration that is placed around Midwich and is there is obviously quite paternal and paternalistic and old school. This book was published in 1957, you know, so you've got to expect it to reflect its times, because good science fiction is metaphor and always reflects its times. In the adaptation, of course, we have to see female characters grounded because it has to be made obvious. The interesting thing, of course, about the novel is that what you see is a deeply threatened paternity. It's the men who are as disquieted by the fact that suddenly their wives are pregnant and they feel threatened, and there seems to be no rational explanation why. And, you know, this is like a real issue, and this is in the novel. And of course, we know in theory that we could raise through cloning whole sort of tranche of humanity without men being involved. You know, we'll see. But the whole idea that, you know, the novel is old-fashioned, that it doesn't deal with issues like women's rights and, you know, a patriarchy is absolute nonsense. It does. It shows the fragility of the patriarchy in Midwich when you see how the men react. But who can blame them? So the Midwich Cuckoos is still very relevant as a text, even in today's post-feminist world. It doesn't need updating. What it needs is fealty to get the ideas across. If it's, you know, it's still ahead. I mean, my view on this is there's one thought, which is that nothing dates like old science fiction. I absolutely disagree. To me, if it's great SF, it remains relevant. And, you know, this is great SF, and that's a marker of it that is still relevant. So the Cuckoos, of course, are blonde, superhuman, and they fit like a Hegelian idealist version of humanity. They're analogous to the Nazi fantasy of the Übermensch, the Superman, the Overman. And, you know, this Penguin Classics edition, which I think is out of print out to me, is the best cover, and it shows the golden eyes of the children. And they're described in the book. And, of course, they are pretty much identical. Their hair structure, their nails, their skin, their glowing golden eyes, hence the glasses. And, you know, this is why, you know, it's important. They're all exactly the same. They're all the same for a reason. They have no genetic material from the people of Midwich. Their mothers are not their mothers. Yes, when they're in the womb, there's placenta and, you know, the blood circulates, what have you, but there isn't any actual development. When they're placed in the womb, they're already developing. They're developing very, very quickly. They're just there for the last few months. And of course, in the novel, when they're about 5 years old, they're like teenagers. You know, they grow really rapidly. They're a super race. You know, they are way ahead. They're pure-blooded. Their mothers are not impregnated by the aliens. I'm saying this again to make it really sort of clear that, you know, they're simply implanted embryos in utero. The Cuckoos are taking the nourishment from the host, but no genetic material. So in the series, we see the Cuckoos as diverse in appearance, different children of different skin colour, what have you. And, you know, this is missing the point of the book. The Cuckoos are the ultimate racists. They are Nazis. They are all genetically identical. They're homogenous. And this is where the real point about diversity in the novel comes across, which is that the Cuckoos aren't even individuals. As Zellaby points out, there are only two individuals, a male and a female. They're a Gestalt hive mind entity. Their minds are connected, they're genetically identical. There's a boy and there's a girl, but they have numerous bodies. They're not diverse at all. Their strength is in unity, is in conformity, is in sameness, is in genetic identity, which is identical. And they act as a group. There's that thing where he shows in the novel how if one has an experience, they don't all perceive it in the same way. They all like to perceive it through their senses. But if one knows something, they all know something. They all learn from each other. So they learn very quickly and their knowledge growth is exponential. And, you know, as their bodies grow very quickly as well. So it's their genetic uniformity that allows them to link and have the massive psionic powers like telekinesis, which they have. Now, if they had genes from human parents on Earth, this wouldn't work. That's the whole thing. So the Midwich Cuckoos are not diverse. They're identical. And they show us the danger of the identical, thinking the same, looking the same, being the same, and the horror that that naturally fills us with, not just politically, but biologically as well, because we know that to be healthy, we need not to inbreed, we need genetic diversity, we need the melting pot, we need all that stuff, and that's good stuff. So it just goes to show. So the actual argument, you know, about the moral question of whether it's right to kill the Cuckoos in the Midwich Cuckoos, and Zellaby finally decides to sort of take the ultimate sacrifice, and he uses an opportunity because he's gained their trust to destroy the Midwich Cuckoos, is, you know, he says that to live in the jungle, you must live as the jungle does. But he's actually preserving humanity's diversity by getting rid of this terrible conformity. This is presaged in the book by other moments when the people of Midwich, or a certain circle of them, learn there have been other day outs, and there's been one, an Inuit one or an Eskimo one in the sort of very polar part of North America, where the children, when they're born to the people there, are killed at birth because they're too different. You know, obviously we think of Inuit and Eskimo people as having dark hair and certain complexions, what have you, and of course the Midwich cuckoos are blonde, golden-eyed Aryans, you know. So, and of course it happens in Russia as well, so we see them wiped out. So Midwich cuckoos, you know, works on several levels as an argument against Nazi conformity and hive mind totalitarianism of the communist variety. And it does this not by flagging ethnicity up and putting it into our faces, but by doing it gently and showing that the conformity of the Midwich cuckoos is the most dangerous thing. The TV series in this way is ham-fisted, and it misses the point by making the cuckoos resemble children of different races. It's a complete fail. They're not cuckoos if they are diverse. Oh, they're only cuckoos if they're all the same, and that's the point. So this is a focus on science. This is the science in the science fiction. The science in the Midwich cuckoos is very much about the danger of genetic conformity and what that does. And, you know, it's an indictment of the Nazis' dreams of sort of genetic racial purity and all that sort of thing. So the real sort of payoff is Celebi's sacrifice. And, you know, it's sort of metaphoric of the sacrifices that many people in Britain in World War II made against the Nazis, and people worldwide did against the Axis powers, you know, not just the British. In World War II, we pushed totalitarianism away. We showed that we weren't going to sort of accept it. And people of all colours, stripes, nationalities, what have you, took part in that and repelled the Axis. We entered the Cold War with different types of totalitarian thinking that have been emerging anyway, and it's an ongoing struggle. But we do that not by sort of these surface things. We do by looking at the detail. And in Midwich cuckoos, the very idea that the cuckoos would be diverse is just a complete ironic fail, and it shows the silliness of this decision, which has been made entirely politically. You know, I have no issue with that. I have no problem with, for example, in Foundation, there are lots of characters who are male in the book and they're female in the TV series. There's people of colour in it. And, you know, when you look at Foundation and you read it, and, you know, there's one major female character in it. And it would be ridiculous to imagine, you know, a far future without, you know, all sorts of people and what have you, and without women in prominent places. So it doesn't work. So it's not about that. It's about the fact that when you look at the science of the Midwich cuckoos, the point is that the cuckoos themselves are alien humanoid clones. And this is what underlines the real point of Wyndham's book, which is that it's the genetic conformity that's dangerous and that diversity is a good thing. And when it comes to survival, you know, you do have to make very difficult decisions. Just one more thought on that. One thing that's always baffled me as a bookseller is why there's so little fiction by British authors about World War II, from the World War II period. And there are things by Alexander Barron, there's The Cruel Sea by Nicholas Monserrat. But whenever I'm asked in work, and my friends have had this as well, and we've sort of wrestled with it for decades, there's a real lack of great World War II fiction by British writers set during the war and written by people who were there, and it's almost as if we're ashamed of it. And then I came to the realization much later on when Empire of the Sun by J.G. Ballard came out, which did really well because that's one of the few novels about World War II, even though it's Japanese prisoner of war camp and it's not active participants, is that, you know, the science fiction had already got there and was already talking about World War II in a very metaphoric way and in a very powerful way. So this is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. I do hope you read The Midwich Cuckoos yourselves. And, you know, it's a wonderful novel. There's all sorts of great detail in there. It's really chilling. And as I say, for me, Wyndham's finest, best written novel and his most important one. Bye for now.